Welcome back to another edition of Just Talking with Joe Burdick. My next guest, he's a Navy veteran, an entrepreneur, and the founder of one of the most innovative whiskey companies in the country, Cleveland Whiskey. What makes this conversation interesting isn't just the business he built, it's how he built it. From military service to disrupting a centuries old industry, Tom Lix has lived in two worlds that both demand discipline, risk taking, and leadership under pressure. We're going to talk about his time in the Navy, what it actually teaches you about leadership and resilience, and how those lessons carried into building a company in a tradition heavy industry like whiskey. But more than that, this is a conversation about betting on yourself when nobody else sees the vision in it yet, and what it takes to keep going when things don't go according to plan. Tom, I appreciate you being here. Welcome to my podcast.
Thanks, Joe. I think you've said enough, and this is probably good enough for the podcast. I don't know if I can add anything. So thank
Well,
you.
I'm sure you will. Let's start from the beginning. Did you grow up here in Cleveland?
No, my mom did, though. And she actually met my father. He was a vet from World War II, was here on the GI Bill going to Cleveland State. And they met, moved back to New Jersey, and that's where I was born and raised, at least my childhood. But my mom moved back to Cleveland late in life. She got ill. I came out with my wife to care for her and found it was a great place to start a business.
So, what made you join the Navy?
Uh, it's interesting because, I'm sort of the time when there were a lot of protests going on. I was protesting the Vietnam War. I was tear gassed for the first time, not in boot camp, but during some of those marches I was in. But then I found I had a high lottery number, so I wasn't going to get drafted. And but friends of mine from high school were dying, and I just felt like I needed to do something. And I loved the ocean. I loved sailing. I loved the water. I had some misconceptions about things I'd be able to see on submarines and everything else. So I thought I'd join up. It seemed like the right thing to do.
So, is that what you did? You were a submariner?
Well, I signed up for the nuclear power program and submarines. And of course, and this is going to sound silly to people today, but, back in the day, all we knew about submarines was what we saw in science fiction, 30,000 Leagues Under the Sea, books we read and things like that. And in all those books, generally on a submarine, they had big windows. You could look out and see the octopus and the whales and everything else. And I thought, oh my God, that's what a submarine was. And it wasn't until I was in boot camp and telling somebody about, I was looking forward to being on a sub, and they're just laughing at me saying, "You idiot! There's no windows in submarines. You're not going to see any of that." So that was my first sort of disappointment. And later on, I wound up leaving the nuclear program and winding up on a couple of old destroyers and things like that, which was lucky because that's what sort of got me into distilling.
Wow. Yeah, those destroyers, for me, that's a little thing. I was on
Yeah.
an aircraft carrier, so
Oh, yeah. Big difference.
yeah, the tin can sailors, right?
Yep, exactly. We were targets. We were. That's our job was to get in the way of torpedoes before they hit the aircraft carriers.
Hmm. So what was boot camp like back then? That was what, during Vietnam then?
Yeah, I joined. Well, I joined in '72. Actually, went to boot
Tail end.
camp like very early in February. It was the tail. It was at the tail end, and which is funny because I'm a Vietnam era veteran, but I'm not a Vietnam veteran. And
Right.
there's an important distinction, and but yeah, it was right at the end, and I wound up actually in places like the Red Sea and the Strait and all the things that we're talking about in the news now. Spent time in Bahrain and in Pakistan and that whole area of the country, which was a little bit friendlier at that point. A little
Did you
bit.
did you go to Karachi?
I did.
Yep,
Yeah.
I was there.
Yeah.
So what did you do in the Navy?
I was a machinist mate. Uh, I got out in '79 as a first class machinist mate, and
I
I
could see
I
how that
worked.
would translate to distillery.
Well, it did because I had I was sort of given a couple of options when I left the nuclear power program. I'll go back a little bit. Um, I loved what I was learning, and I was soaking it all up. And of course, I was supplementing what I was learning in school. I was going to the libraries and everything else, and I found that in libraries, the civilian scientists were talking about safe levels of radiation, which were far less than what the Navy was telling us was safe levels of radiation. So I brought that up, and of course, I was told to forget that. This is what you do, and this, forget it. And as I read more and more, I didn't want to forget it, so I sort of took it up the chain of command. And nobody wanted to listen to me, but I tend to be a little bit of a disruptor, so I kept going, and it wound up being heard. I didn't meet him, but being heard by Admiral Rickover, the father of the nuclear Navy. And I was invited into a conference room with a bunch of high-ranking officials or officers, and said that they said I was clearly unhappy, and if I wanted to leave the nuclear program, they could arrange that for me. But I had aced everything. I was on top of my class for all these schools and everything, and so they couldn't really just kick me. I suppose they could have, but they couldn't really just kick me out. So we made some deals, and I got my choice of schools I wanted to go to. I got choice of where I wanted to be sent. By then I'd already served on a destroyer, and I love the fact that you go into the small ports and see things that if you're on an air conditioner,
we had a lot of good air conditioning on aircraft.
You get good air conditioning, and so I picked some destroyers. I went up on a couple of destroyers, a fast frigate, but got a lot of schools out of it. And one of the schools I got was distilling school. And that's what sort of led me in this direction. And when I got assigned to my first destroyer, it was an old destroyer about to be decommissioned. None of the officers were really there on a regular basis. And it was also a reserve destroyer, so it didn't go out that much. And the first day on board, I walk on, and this chief comes up to me. He says, "Kid," obviously it was a long time ago. He says, "Kid, you're going to be my apprentice here." So I had no idea what he was talking about, but we went through a bunch of spaces. Finally, at the hatch, we open up the hatch and go down a ladder, and there he has this jury-rigged still that he had set up, and he was fermenting fruit juice from the galley, the bug juice, the Kool-Aid sort of stuff we took, and a lot of sugar. And for a distill, all you really need is a cooling source and a heating source. So he had tapped into the steam lines that went throughout the ship for his heating source. And for a cooling source, you got the salt water flowing through the veins of the ship to cool the equipment. And for firefighting, well, he had tapped into one of those lines as well. He had a cooling source. And he was making bootleg spirits, what he called hooch. And not only for our ship, but all the surrounding ships. And he had quite a thriving business. And that's where I learned distilling. And I have since, I didn't, President Obama actually, when he was a sitting president, he visited our distillery. The only time the president had ever visited a distillery. George Washington owned one, but it was after he was president. But I didn't tell him that story because he was our commander in chief. But I have since told it to a number of admirals who have come through and toured the facility and everything else. So it's sort of public knowledge at this point. And I assume that the time has passed where I can be prosecuted for it. So, but yeah, that's where I learned distilling, because the fundamentals are the same.
You should have told the president that. I'm sure he would have got a kick out of it.
He probably would have. I mean, we had a great visit when he was here, no matter what your politics are. I mean, it was amazing that it was here. He was supposed to spend 4 to 6 minutes with us, just sort of pass through, say something to the press, and that was it. He spent close to 40 minutes with us. Every time his staff would come up and say, "Mr. President, we're running late. We're missing, this next thing," he just sort of put up his hand, and he's tall and lanky, and he, raised his hand and said, "Yeah, I'm good. We'll stay here for a little while longer," and it was a great time. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a heck of an honor, no matter what your politics are.
Yeah.
If a president, and I think that's the thing that probably drives me nuts. If somebody gets an opportunity to meet a president, no matter what side, and they say no, you don't get those opportunities every day. I wouldn't turn down an invitation to meet a president. I don't care who they are.
Yeah.
But no, that's pretty cool that he did that. I saw the picture. I'm actually gonna edit it in at the end when before I put this out.
Okay. Yeah.
So, how did
It's
serving?
almost a shame. It's a shame that you have to say, no matter what your politics are. It's just, that's just the way of the world. So,
I mean, I mean, I'm gonna be, I'm gonna be, I'm gonna. Well, I am 57. I keep forgetting how old I am. I'm 57. When I was a kid, it wasn't like this. When your guy
right.
lost, you just try to get in 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so crazy how people are politically, I mean, I never even knew my parents, which way they voted when I
Yeah.
was a
I,
kid
I don't
because we
think
didn't
I
talk
don't think
about
I
it.
did either. But that's a
Yeah.
whole other podcast. We'll do that
Yeah.
another
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did serving change how you think about risk?
Yeah. Well, it made me a lot more serious about things. That's for sure. I took my life more seriously. I took my future more seriously. I learned to focus. I learned to learn better. Um, I think I learned to evaluate risk better. While I was never in combat, I certainly, we went through this hurricane once in an old destroyer, and we all thought we were going to die. And then I remember a situation where in that hurricane the steam lines were being twisted apart as the ship sort of twisted, and they were breaking, and I was on watching the engine room, and we had some lines break, and I burned my lungs, I burned my eyes, and literally I realized the value of training because if I didn't know where the valve was that I needed to shut off, I would have died on the lower level of the engine room. So it taught me a lot of good things. Um, yeah,
So you go from that level of structure and discipline to eventually building your own path in the civilian world. That's a big shift.
yeah. It was. Well, when I got out of the service, I went back to school. I was serious about it. I did a little bit of catch up and finished my undergraduate degree, and then I went on and got a doctorate. And I never would have done that, years ago before I got serious about things.
So what was your plan coming out of the Navy, what you wanted to do?
I'm not sure I really had a plan, except that I thought, okay, I'm going to go to business school. And I felt like I had some catching up to do with my contemporaries, who had already graduated college and whatever, which is why I stayed in graduate school. I had always had little businesses, growing up, even as a kid. I would refurbish rowboats, turn them into sailboats, and sell them on my front lawn. There was always something that I was doing, businesses I was starting, even in school, and I thought that someday I would do something. I didn't know what it was yet, but and of course, I had lots of ideas over time. Some failed and some did well, and that was it.
So where did you get the idea for Cleveland whiskey?
So I read this article. It was a long time ago, but I read an article about the growing middle class in China, and they were talking about that as people entered the middle class, they were interested in luxury goods or uh, uh, affordable luxuries. And it sort of came to mind. I had done that little bit of distilling while I was in the Navy, so I was thinking about stuff like that. But um, and I thought, it's not really affordable luxuries; it's conspicuous affordable luxuries, things that you can share and show off a little bit with friends. So then I dug a little deeper. I reached out to the author. Now, remember, I had just gotten my doctorate in marketing and information systems, and so I was sort of in that mode. So I was doing more research, and sure enough, it was things like imported whiskey from Scotland and from America, and as the middle class rose, the consumption was rising. The amount of volume going into the countries was rising, both not only in China but in Africa and India, in South America, in parts of Europe. I mean, there was going to be what I felt a tsunami of demand. And I use the phrase, you can't crank up production in whiskey like cornflakes and computer parts. It takes a lot of time. And I'm not a patient person. I've always been sort of amateur chemist. I say that, if I had a better attention span, I would be a chemist because I really love it. So I started experimenting in my basement and, went through um, I don't know what the exact number, a little over 900 exploding mason jars. And probably because I wasn't a real chemist, I made some mistakes, but wound up with this really interesting technology that allows us to do any number of things. We can, speed up the process, but that's relatively insignificant. But it speeds up our research and development process, which is more significant. It also allows us to use other woods. So instead of just using oak barrels, we can use woods like sugar maple and hickory and apple and black cherry and get some really, truly amazing flavors. And more recently, it's allowed us to develop a whiskey concentrate or a series of whiskey concentrates that we can sell overseas where the markets are growing.
So for people who don't know, what makes Cleveland whiskey different?
Yeah, so pretty much every other distillery out there, if you are a producing distillery, you take grain and you ferment it, and then the distillation process essentially concentrates that alcohol. You try to boil off the water, just like what I learned in the Navy, making fresh water out of salt water. You sort of slowly boil it and you bring off the vapors, and then those vapors you want to condense their steam, and you leave the salt behind, and that steam you condense back. That's why you need the cooling source into a liquid. So that's how you make fresh water. Same thing with an alcohol, whether it's a whiskey or a vodka or anything like that. You have a low level of alcohol from the fermentation, and you just want to concentrate that. But then with whiskey, I mean, there are some rules associated with it, but essentially then you get 80% of the flavor and 100% of the color, because it comes off clear off the still, 100% of the color from putting it in a oak barrel. And in that oak barrel, every day, you've got a slight temperature change, you've got some pressure changes, the alcohol moves down to the pore structure of the wood, and that's what gives it the flavor and the color. So again, there's specific rules around it, but that's basically what you do. But it's always around putting in a barrel. And barrels are interesting because they weren't designed to make whiskey. They were, transportation and storage containers well before anybody thought about doing that. They were made from these oaks that held liquid very well. You couldn't really make them from other woods. I'm sure other people did and tried, but they would leak like a sieve because oak, European oaks, white American white oak, they have a certain grain structure and pore structure that allows them to expand just a little bit to tighten up the seals so you can store liquid in them. And so everybody does them in barrels, and that's it. But what we do, and it's a slow process. It takes, depending on the climate you're in, it takes, 4, 6, 10, 12 years. And as I said before, I'm not a patient person. So what we do is we take relatively young spirits, sometimes haven't been in a barrel at all, but sometimes they're in a barrel for a while, only so that we can follow the rules about making bourbon and rye whiskeys and things like that. But then we empty that young spirit into a pressure-capable stainless steel tank, and then put a measured amount of wood in that tank as well. We cut it to a certain size and shape, control for moisture content. We oxygenate in the environment. All things to pretty much replicate what's going on when you have it in a barrel, but to do it more aggressively, because then we apply pressure variations. And to best explain that, I'll use a bucket and a sponge analogy. Think of a bucket with water in it, and you take a sponge and you put it in the bucket, and you squeeze it a couple times. It's now absorbed all the water, but you keep it under the water, you squeeze it, it's in your hand, the pores are dry. It's even underwater because you're holding it tight. When you let it go, the water rushes right back into that sponge. And you do that over and over again. So the water's going in and out of the pore structure of the sponge. We essentially do the same thing. I mean, there's some patents and trade secrets and things around it, but essentially we're squeezing the wood like a sponge, which allows the alcohol to aggressively move into the pore structure of the wood. And then we push it out aggressively as well. So we get a lot of flavor out of the wood, a smaller amount than you would use in a barrel. And it allows us to use other woods. So again, if I don't want to use oak, or I don't want to minimize the oak, I can use apple wood, for instance, and I can create whiskeys that might start with some oak to give them the traditional whiskey flavor, but then I might want to finish it off with apple or black cherry wood or peach or plum or anything like that. And you can get some pretty unique and interesting flavors that way. And you can't do it by just putting those woods inside a barrel. because the oak is a very assertive and aggressive flavor. It's going to overwhelm anything you put inside it. So by taking young spirits, I've minimized or at least regulated the amount of oak exposure I give to that young spirit, and I can pretty much custom develop a flavor, which we do a lot of.
So you challenged a pretty traditional industry. What was the initial reaction?
It wasn't favorable. Um, we had uh, I mean, it's a very traditional industry. I get it, and a lot of the marketing is around it takes time and patience and all of that stuff. And people talk about limestone waters, which and in Kentucky they say, well, you can only make bourbon in Kentucky, which isn't the truth. I mean, there's a lot of things that go around, but um, we had this one very on now we had this one product we were making, and we were only using oak at that point. We hadn't realized we could use these other woods, but so we were making what we thought were equivalent to some of the better brands, and we had a brand called the Cleveland Black Reserve. It was 100 proof, and we decided to do some blind tastings, taste testing, and we did over 3,600 blind taste tests of our Black Reserve against Knob Creek, which is also 100 proof, so it's good fair comparison. It's a well-respected bourbon, priced reasonably high but not exorbitant. And it was a Jim Beam, now it's a Suntory Beam product, and what I personally like. So I said, gee, if we can compare ourselves to them, and maybe we'll do, maybe 2 out of 10 people will like it as much as or better than Knob Creek. That was sort of what I was shooting for. But in 3,600 blind taste tests, we wound up winning 54% of the time.
Hmm.
So I knew we weren't just drinking our own Kool-Aid or our own whiskey, but we had a good product, but people didn't like us. And we had this one reviewer in one of the very traditional whiskey magazines, and there's a couple of them. And he wrote this essentially 3-part review of our Black Reserve. Now, remember, we knew it was maybe it's not the best product in the world, but it was good. It was worthwhile to put in the marketplace. But he started with his first paragraph talked about how it was sacrilege and it had a religious flavor almost to his first paragraph. He talked about the sacrilege associated with making something with science and technology, that it was heresy, that it was morally wrong and corrupt for us to be trying to do something in a way that took away from the merits and the respect of all the people who had gone before, and really created the best and perfect way to make whiskey. First paragraph. Second paragraph was, and there was a fervor to it. It was really strongly written. The second paragraph said, but no matter that, there's no possible way you can use science and technology to improve on something that is already perfect. And so he talked about that for a while. Then his third paragraph started with, despite what I've said, I'm going to give it a fair and impartial review. And there's no way you could believe that at that point, given how he had talked about it. But that's what he said. And then to summarize what he said about it, in the end, he said he thought it tasted like, and excuse my language, but it was his, he thought it tasted like sheep piss. Sheep piss. And so I immediately posted that on Facebook. And the first comment I got back within seconds almost was, how the hell would he know what sheep piss tastes like? And and then we got other comments saying, he should, if that's what he's drinking, he should be never allowed to judge a whiskey again. And it was like, so we just sort of embraced that criticism, knowing that the real traditionalists, the real diehards, they're not going to change. But there are certain people there are more people that are willing to try something different, who are interested in what science and technology can do. And, we found that, and we have some begrudging acceptance at this point, where because we use the other woods, that's something the traditional distillers don't do. So it doesn't necessarily hurt the image of them. We're doing something different. But, even today, there's certainly some negativity. We don't find that in Asia at all, which is where we're sort of developing our markets. But here in the U.S. and certainly in Europe, especially Scotland, I think they probably a curse word. So Cleveland whiskey. Oh my God, yeah.
So what was the hardest part in the beginning? Was it the funding, the production, or the credibility?
Uh, if we had worried about the credibility, that would have been the hardest part because that was the one that we had the least amount of control over. Funding was, knock on wood, relatively easy in that I produced sample products. So whereas most venture capital meetings were pretty dry and you had presentations and all this other stuff, I just brought in samples and say, hey, here's what's made a traditional way, and this took 8 years to make, and here's what I just made, and I made it in 24 hours. Do you want to invest in this? And we did okay.
Is that
So
literally how long it takes to make 24 hours?
no, it's a little bit longer than that, but it's not that long. I mean, our process itself takes anywhere from 18 to 24 hours, 26 hours, depending on what we're making and what woods we're working with. And generally, we leave raw spirits in a barrel for 6 months. So but it's a much faster, and again, it allows us to experiment a lot. We can tweak pressures and dwell times and temperatures of all sorts of things, oxygen levels, and we can be doing those tests every 24 hours. And if it improves it, if it makes it better, we work it into the program. That's part of the formula going forward. If it doesn't, it gets scrapped. And we've experimented with a lot of things. A lot of things have, gone down the drain. Not in a way that is environmentally irresponsible, but they've been discarded. And then we move on.
So was there ever a thought? Was there ever a moment when you thought it might not work?
No,
No, that's good.
it's a
What was
short
your
answer.
first
I
real
know.
breakthrough? Yeah, that's all
Um,
right.
the first breakthrough was really in my basement. I seriously was blowing up mason jars, and my late wife, she was convinced that somebody was going to call the police because you'd hear these little muffled explosions every time one burst. And I had put up a plexiglass screen and everything else, so I was safe from them, but glass was going all over the place. And then every weekend, I would go down to the local, hardware store that had the ice machines out in front of them, and I'd fill up the back of my station wagon. I'd bring it all back, and I'd be throwing ice down this old coal chute in the basement of my house. And I'm sure the neighbors wondered what we were doing, but my wife thought they're going to call us and say these guys have a meth lab in their basement or something. So she was thrilled when we moved into a real facility, a little laboratory. That was our next
She
step.
must have been a very patient woman. Mine wouldn't put up
Yeah,
with that.
yeah, yeah. She was for sure.
Was it important for the brand to be rooted in Cleveland?
Um, it's interesting. We did some because I wasn't originally from Cleveland,
Right.
so we did some research and in testing names, and we tested a lot of different names, including Cleveland whiskey. Uh, and in fact, it was the ad agency I was using at the time that sort of pushed me to test that as a name. I'm not sure I would have if they hadn't pushed me in that direction. And I won't give you any of the other names, but because we still may use some of them in the future or whatever. But um, it tested really well, and we tried to eliminate when they did the interviews. They eliminated anybody who had any relationship with Cleveland because I wanted to know, look, Cleveland, it's going to sell in Cleveland. That's fine, but I wanted to sell in California. I wanted to sell, around the country. So I want to talk to people who don't have a relative, had never lived in Cleveland, didn't go to school in Cleveland. They had no thing. But at the time, they thought, that Cleveland was hardworking and entrepreneurial. And I thought, well, that's good. We like that. That's positive. And we tested the likelihood of sales of different brands at different price points under different names, and Cleveland came out pretty much on top. And then once I named the company Cleveland Whiskey, I knew I was going to stay here in Cleveland. So, and that was a great decision. It's a great city. It's a wonderful city. And I had
Yeah.
moved here from Boston.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I just went to Boston last year. I actually went to Gloucester, but
Well, my
well,
my my wife. Now I mentioned my other wife had passed away. My wife is from Gloucester.
I fell in love with that city.
That's a beautiful city.
And I went there because of the movie, and I went whale
Mhm.
watching, and
Yeah,
I tried to experience all of Gloucester that I could. I fell in love with it.
yeah. It's a wonderful city.
Yeah. I want to go back. I want to take the kids
Yeah.
back with me.
Yeah.
So what's been harder, starting a business or scaling it?
Um, I think starting it is, you can start it in lots of different ways. And I've started in other businesses, you know, that's relatively easy.
Hmm.
I think then figuring out how to make it grow and how to make it profitable, that's the hard part.
Right.
Then you're hiring people, you're doing other things. There's a whole lot more to it. It's no longer the wow, this is fun because I'm experimenting, I'm creating these new products, and look at this, and it's first time in the market. It's all that exciting stuff, but then you've got to deal with payroll and taxes and regulations and getting permits and hiring people and firing people. I mean, it's there's a lot of stuff to be done, and looking at the legal bills you incur and the accounting bills that you incur, and making those transitions as you get bigger and bigger. It's challenging, and it's stressful. You're really invested in this. This is 24/7. This is your baby. So,
In Cuyahoga County, taxes are not cheap.
well, I wouldn't say they're cheap anywhere. It's just sometimes they're taken from you in different ways. But uh, yeah, it's and I understand the need for them, but it can be a little challenging.
So how have the local businesses been with this? The Tony Georges and the other business and restaurant and bar owners, do they supply your
Uh,
product?
so we made a sort of a conscious decision not to, because typically with a new distillery, you really work on getting your product in the bars. And that was because the bartenders were the gatekeepers. They're the ones who made people aware of the product. They're the ones because ultimately you don't really make any money in a bar. You make it because people buy your bottles off the shelf.
Hmm.
So, but social media, I believe, changed that to a large extent. I mean, certainly bartenders are incredibly important, but they're not the only way to get to market. And so and also, there's some pay to play aspects of it and things like that that I wasn't all that happy with. So we really didn't try to get into a lot of places. And even today, we're not nearly in as many bars and restaurants right here in Cleveland as many of our other distilleries and breweries are in the area. That worked out well for us during COVID because when all the bars and restaurants shut down, we didn't have to worry about that market. We were already well entrenched in the retail segment, and that's always pretty much been our focus to work on that, and then try to talk directly to consumers for them to come and try our products. And we do a lot of tastings, we do a lot of events where we sample out our products, and that was our strategy and continues to be our strategy.
How does your whiskey compare to, like a Jim Beam or a Jack Daniels, something like that?
Well, think about, I mean, I was talking about the blind taste tests.
Hmm.
Knob Creek, which is a Jim Beam product. And there, I think we've got some good equivalent products. But more importantly for us is we try to differentiate and make things that nobody else can make and that's where we use the other woods. So we do both a wheated bourbon as well as a rye whiskey using black cherry wood, which is phenomenal, and nobody else is really doing that. And we do some things with applewood that I think are really interesting. Um, um, Honey locust. I mean, woods that you may not even expect. And that's where we try to say, look, we're not trying to make the same thing as everybody else. They're already making that, and
Right.
they're making it at a great scale, and they're making good products. So so we'll do something else.
So how do you approach hiring and building a team?
Um, we're still a relatively small team, and a lot of it is making sure that everybody gets along and can work well together. We don't have to all become best friends, but we have to respect each other and get along. And I've made some really been lucky enough to make some really wonderful, great hires, but I've also made ones that weren't as good as they could have been, and often that's my fault because I misjudged or I misinterpreted, and generally, when I have to let somebody go, it's for the benefit of the company, but also for the benefit of that individual, because it's just not a great fit. It's tough though, and we've had good times and bad times, and sometimes we've had to retrench, we've had to lay people off, and then hire people later, and it's been as I said, it can be a stressful. Anytime you're running a business, it's going to be stressful.
Well, I'll tell you what, I was at the old place a couple of times. I did once for a taste testing down there, and it was about a year ago. I was at the new place, the
Hmm.
giant building. How's that
Yeah.
going?
That's just wonderful for us. It's taking more money than I expected, and it's taking longer than I expected. There's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, we as you know, we have two buildings here, and they're both old. One of them is a historic building built in 1910. Um, it's funny. And it's probably just from your childhood. The story of the three little pigs and the huff and the puff of the to blow the house down, and the brick house was the one that stood everything, and they were safe in there. I thought of this big, old, beautiful brick building was, a fortress. Well, it turns out that brick isn't as strong as I thought, especially over the years. We had to replace a whole wall in one place, and there's all sorts of tuck pointing that has to be done and repairs. So it's taken a lot of money to get there, but I am so glad we're doing it because we brought a building back to life that has a history here in Cleveland. And it's going to be interesting because the area we're in, there's a whole lot of construction and new development going on in here, and we will be this beautiful old historic building with great stories to tell about it. I love it, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
So, what does competition look like for you in the whiskey world?
Um, so there's a lot of competition to get on the shelves. I think that's the big thing. Shelf space is limited. The laws around selling online are really complicated and difficult, and Ohio is actually one of the harder places to do that. But so it's just about standing out and getting people to change their habits, because typically you find a brand or a couple brands, and you stick to them. So getting people to change and try yours is interesting, if not very challenging. Um, which is one of the reasons we've moved into Asia with this whiskey concentrate that we make, which is really different, and our competition is very different. Um, but I mean, it's like anything. If even when you start out, you may have no competition, but if you have a good idea, it's going to follow you. Um, we just try to make a unique product, a good product at a fair price.
So, speaking of bartenders, a little while ago, I used to be a bartender, and
Hmm.
back when I bartended, it seemed like everything was the basic flavors, the Jack Daniels, the Jim
Yep.
Beam, the Crown Royal. Now there's all these novelty flavors. Even
Yep.
Crown Royal comes out,
Yeah.
there's the apple, the peach, the blackberry, I don't even know what else they come out with, but
Which is
whole
part of
market.
the problem. Which is part of the problem from my point of view, because now you have so many choices on the bar. The value of having your bottle on that bar back isn't nearly what it used to be, because now you're one of 50 that people can choose from. So they're pouring you less no matter what. And it just makes it even that much more difficult to work through the bar. I mean, it's great for the consumer. It's great for the person who's having to, has all these choices. But from a producer's point of view, it makes it more expensive to go that route.
Right. So how has your definition of success changed over the years?
Well, I sort of never saw it as an endpoint. So, it's just a journey, and that's the part that I enjoy. And I think about, what we're going to do this week and this month and this quarter and this year. And, I see, in my head, I have this vision of, where I hope this will ultimately be in terms of the building and the restaurant and our production capabilities. And then, now I see it with, things like this 6,200 seat amphitheater that's being built literally right next to us,
Hmm.
which changes the dynamics around how much traffic we'll get in, and what we need in terms of having bars built and everything else. So we're focusing on that. But at the same time, we're really expanding into Asia, and we've got some unique products that we're bringing there. I've now been to India twice in the last 6 months or so,
Hmm.
and I think there are great opportunities there. Today I wrote a proposal for a group in Singapore as well as one in South Korea. So, it's um, the nature of the game will be changing. I don't know what success will be. I mean, I'm that I have this dream of sailing across the Atlantic by myself in a boat that I totally rebuild. So I have this old in about 50 feet away from me and stored away. I have this old 1976 Francis 26, a small boat but heavy displacement. I think it can go across the ocean, and I'm rebuilding it specifically with that in mind. But I need to have this place be okay if I don't come back. So that's sort of that's my plan at this point. So
I
I'm
think you
not sure
showed me
where I'll
that
get there.
boat when I was there.
Yeah, it's still there.
So, what motivates you now compared to when you started?
um, you know, I'm not really sure. That's a great question, and it's not as though I'm reaching for this golden ring or that I'm seeing something. I think I just um, I want to make sure I can make payroll and treat people fairly and have a good product. And I like it when people come here and they're happy and they get to try things and taste things and just discover us for the first time, or they're coming back. I think I enjoy my job. When I'm typically here a lot over the weekends, sometimes working on my boat, but also working on the company. And but certainly Monday mornings, I'm antsy to get back here. There are things to be done. What my motivation is, I don't know. I'm just sort of a natural entrepreneur. I I have to do this. It's not as though I feel like I have a choice. What else would I do? Plus,
Right.
nobody would hire me at this point. So yeah.
So, what advice would you give veterans transitioning into entrepreneurship?
Um, well, number one, I want to make sure we define entrepreneurship properly because I have some differences of opinion. So you can buy a job by buying a franchise. And I think a lot of people think of that as being an entrepreneur. And I sort of question that. I think being an entrepreneur is you're doing something different and you're developing it yourself and whatever. You can be a good business manager, a good business person, and everything else by doing. And I've seen vets come out and be very successful by buying franchises and multiplying them and making a lot of money along the way. An entrepreneur, I think, it's riskier, um, but I would say you just have to do it. Use Nike's term, just do it. Don't get caught up in spending years putting together a plan or saving enough money to do things. Do it while you're still young. Do it, while your family isn't, demanding your attention all the time because it will. This is not something easy. You're going to spend a lot of time at it, and it's tough. But yeah, I would say you just think of something and try it. Do things that are close to your heart that you like. You don't want to make a product that you don't really care for, or you don't want to be in a job where you're producing something that you have no interest in at all. Um, I don't know. I mean, you could make beautiful wavy flags out of wood. That would be, and really love it. That would
I
be
know a
a
guy that
cool
does
thing.
that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, those are things that you just sort of like doing.
So, all right, I didn't even have this question for you, but is it a job for you?
Um,
Because the way you
it's
talk
not.
about it is you
It's
love it,
not
and
like
if you love it,
yeah. Yeah, it's not like going to a job. It's
yeah,
not like going to a job for a paycheck. It's this is just part of my life. And yeah, I mean, I do love it. Not to say that every day I love it. There are times
mhm,
when I throw up on hands or I get upset, or things aren't going right, or I feel like we should be making more progress or whatever. Um, but it's not like, oh my God, I got to go back to work again, or I can't wait until Friday, or because then the next day will be Saturday. I can't wait for the week. I can't wait to go on vacation. It's challenging for your family, just like military families. It's challenging because you're away from them. Being the spouse of an entrepreneur is also incredibly challenging and difficult. It's difficult on the spouse, it's difficult on the children because you're at this business. And I mean, some things are more challenging than others. Heaven forbid, the people I give great credit to who run restaurants, it's like that's their entire life. So this is a step removed from that. This is, production and manufacturing. It's a little bit different, but
Right.
it's just tough. It's tough for the people around you. Um, yeah, but do it. That's it. Just do it.
Right. Just do it and gamble on yourself, right?
And yeah, and it's also, I think, certain personalities are geared toward it. You sort of know if that's you. Um, I now, as somebody who taught entrepreneurship for a while, so that I could have health insurance and things like that. Um, I I don't know as you can learn a lot about being an entrepreneur, learn about the tools of entrepreneurship and things that you need help you, but you can't go to school to become an entrepreneur. I think that's something that's the type of person you are.
So one of the things I like to do from time to time is I like to ask a couple of rapid fire questions.
Go for it.
All right. What's your favorite whiskey besides your own?
Bushmill 16. It's a Irish whiskey that I like a lot.
Okay. Morning routine, structured or chaotic?
It's both chaotic and structured. I have 5 dogs, 4 parrots, 4 guinea pigs, assorted fish, and my wife and I both split those responsibilities. So I wake up every morning at 5:30 because I can't ever get up later than 6 because I have 5 small dogs who will not let me. So they're the ones who give me a routine. Get them outside, feed them, get them outside again, then get the birds' food ready. Finally, I get my coffee, and that's it.
Okay. Best advice you have ever received?
Oh, um, yeah, I know it's supposed to be rapid fire. I'm supposed to give you an answer right away.
That's all right.
Um,
This is why I don't give people the questions ahead of time. I like it raw.
I think the best advice was don't worry about failing. Think about what you learned from that failure and use it going forward.
Okay. What's the worst advice?
Um, get a job.
One book everyone should read.
Jonathan Livingston Seagull, which is sort of an odd choice, but I think that is, and it's an inspirational book about this seagull that is doing things that is outside the ordinary and being made fun of and criticized and everything else because everybody told him he couldn't do it, but he did. And that to me, I think, was the most inspirational book I've ever read.
Okay. Biggest risk you've ever taken?
Every time I start a new business, it has been, I max out the credit cards, I do everything else, but it's that, and I would say another big risk is getting married. Yeah, it's another big risk.
Yep. So one word to describe your leadership style. One word.
Hmm. Um, Geez, I don't know. I I believe that they talk about different types of leadership styles and different types of management styles and everything else. I think you have to deal with each person as an individual,
Mhm.
so that whatever style you have to adapt and make sure that you act with each individual employee in a way that makes sense for both them and you. Um, so I don't know whether that's a style or not, but I believe in that sincerely. That because there's been so many business books and written about, and tests you can take to find out what style you have, and I think it's you've just got to depend on the individuals you're working with.
Right. So a couple more questions before I let you go. What does being a veteran mean to you today?
Uh, I'm incredibly proud of the service. I'm also of the generation that when people were coming home from Vietnam and I was still in service and then getting out, where there was no respect for veterans. And today, I have mixed feelings when people say thank you for your service, because for me it's way past when I served. But I'm proud of it. I know that it made a real big difference in my life. I know it made me a much better person. Um, and I think that as much as I gave it, it gave me a lot more back.
I'll tell you what, anytime I see a veteran in a hat, especially a Vietnam veteran, I
Hmm.
always tell them, thank you for your service. And
Yeah,
then, of course, I always tell the Vietnam vets, welcome home. And a
yeah,
lot of times they'll say, hey, that was a long time ago, whatever. And I just respond with, I'm guessing you didn't hear it enough. So,
yeah, and which is probably true.
yeah.
Probably true. Yeah, it's a tough one, and I definitely have mixed feelings about it, because I remember being spit at, and
And there's people today that will say that that didn't happen,
it
which
did
is
happen. Yeah,
ridiculous.
it
Yeah.
did happen. Yeah,
Oh, I believe it.
yeah.
So what does Cleveland mean to you personally?
Uh, Cleveland is a wonderful city. So I think of Cleveland as a uh, Boston 40 or 50 years ago. So they were both world class industrial cities that fell on hard times. Both cities really were run down, and they had an industrial base, and that went away, and everything else. They both had, but they both came back. And Boston is just ahead of the curve. Um, Both cities had environmental issues, and both cities have really taken care of them. I remember the Boston Harbor, where you couldn't get within 100 yards of it without smelling the stink of it.
Really?
And years later, I sailed in it, and it was so much better. And here, we had issues about residue floating on rivers and everything else. And the difference between Boston and here is that Boston doesn't talk about it anymore. Unfortunately, Cleveland still does, and I sort of wish they wouldn't. Um, Both have world class and educational facilities, and I think that's wonderful. They share that. Same thing for healthcare facilities, both world class hospitals and doctors and nurses. Um, uh, it's important. Both places have an educated workforce, both blue collar and white collar. You need them both for a good entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I half jokingly say, no, I don't even say half jokingly say it. I say that one of the things they share also is they had a corrupt political system in both cities. And it wasn't until they pulled themselves out of that corruption when people really started investing in the cities. And I think Cleveland got there a little bit later than Boston, but they've gotten there. And with the exception of small setbacks, you always get, because people are running things. Um, they've done that. I just think that uh, I drive through communities here in Cleveland, and it reminds me so much of communities I was driving through in Boston, 30 or 40 years ago. And then seeing the product when I go back to Boston, because my daughter still lives outside of Boston, the changes it has made in those neighborhoods, how they've changed. And I see the same thing happening here. Both cities have had lots of racial issues, and neither city has totally pulled out of that, but they're doing better and they're trying. So yeah, a lot of comparisons.
Yep. So what do you want your legacy to be both in business and in life?
Um, you know, I don't really think about that.
Mhm.
People have asked me that before, and it's not like, okay, I want this on my tombstone, or I want people to remember me because it's built this company or whatever. I want to do right by my kids and my grandchildren and the people that I've worked with and have worked for me and with me. Um, and if they are, if they can say a few things good about me, I think I've done okay.
That's a good enough legacy right there.
Yeah.
So where can people find your whiskey to support what you're building? And uh, a follow up, is it something you can ship to other states?
Let me answer the second part first, in that it is difficult to ship to other states, although we are bringing on a new system software thing that is going to allow us to ship to 43 states. At least that's my understanding. So that may be much better a few months from now than it is right now. Right now, you can find us in most of the liquor stores here in Ohio, but we also have fairly good distribution in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Um, Technically, we sell in about 20 states, but we've had trouble keeping up with uh, some of the demand, and don't always have a good presence in those other states. So I'd say the three states where we're really good and we make sure the shelves are stocked are Ohio, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Um, and I hope we'll continue expanding as we boost production here in this new facility, which is what we're doing. But then also have a far greater presence overseas as well. I mean, the whiskey industry is in trouble right now domestically. I mean, it's down 25% here in the US and in Europe. I heard a statistic the other day that said that in 2024, they don't have data for 2025 yet. In 2024, one out of every four craft distillers closed the doors.
Hmm.
They just couldn't stay open. So, yeah, so it's helpful when you do buy our products. That
Right.
would be great. And come to our distillery and take a tour and go to clevelandwhiskey.com and figure out when you can come out here. We're also, as we do off and on, we've got a funding round going on. So there's a way to invest. There's a way to become a part owner of this company. And we've done equity crowdfunding before. We have about 2,100 small investors, and I love it because there are evangelists. They're proponents of the brand. They're sharing it with friends, whether that's in California or in a little town outside of Paris. And we've got people all over the place who invested in the company, and I love that, as opposed to just having a couple of big investors. I think that was a great thing we've been able to do.
Yeah, I've seen your social media stuff about that.
Yeah.
So, did you make it down to the USS Cleveland when it was here?
Not this time, but I did when one of the sister ships was
The
here.
Mackinac
And
or
so
whatever?
yeah, so I got a tour of that. My son and I took that tour, and I loved it. So different from the ships that I was on years ago. And it's funny because that class of ship has been criticized and everything else, but I think of some of the situation we're in now, like in the Strait of Hormuz, where that class ship probably would be the right kind of ship to have there. So we'll see. I mean, it'd be nice if we never have to use them, but
Yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah. No, it was a pretty cool ship. I did a couple of tours and I was I'll tell you what, the honor of a lifetime for me. I made the plank owner planks for the crew.
Oh wow, that
Yeah.
is pretty cool. That's very cool.
I mean, it's a tiny, tiny part of Navy
Yeah,
history, and
yeah,
I loved it. So I
yeah.
have one more question for you.
Sure.
Uh, if somebody listens to this entire conversation, which I hope everybody does, what's the one thing you want them to walk away remembering about your product?
Um, Probably the one thing I'd like them to remember is that I think it's worth trying. It's good and it's different. So as opposed, next time you're buying a bottle of whiskey or having a drink, don't necessarily get the same thing you got before. Give something else a try. And I think, the products at Cleveland Whiskey are Cleveland Underground, our Wheat Penny. We've got Magic Rabbit, which is a pretty amazing peanut butter and chocolate whiskey that I didn't want to make, and my son developed it in the background and only let me know when it was done.
Yeah.
There's some interesting things. Yeah,
I'm gonna have to try that. It sounds pretty good.
it's pretty good. Do you have the time for the little story about it?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
He's our. I had to recruit him here, so it's not really a family business. But I've got my son working for me, and he's our national sales director. And he kept coming back and saying, Dad, we've got to get into flavored whiskeys. It's up and coming. A lot of it is selling and everything else. And I kept kicking him out of the office and saying, no, I don't want to do that. We're making serious things here. Our focus is on the niche with the woods. And he'd come back over and over again. I would literally say, get out of here. I don't want to hear this anymore. So him, to his credit, and sort of like what I would have done, is he went behind my back, talked with the operations guys, got them to do some experiments for him. They ran a series of experiments that I didn't know about. And one day he comes into my office and he sets down this little glass. He says, I want you to try this, Dad. And I did, and it was phenomenal. It had like these really dark chocolate notes, and it was smooth. It didn't have that sort of chemical aftertaste. It was very natural. It had that little bit of peanut butter. Turns out it was peanuts and pecans and pralines, a couple of things. They really nailed it. And I said, Andrew, we should make this, because I thought it was somebody else's. He said, well, Dad, we are. And they already had the recipe down, and we just had to come up with a label and a bottle for it, and started selling it, and it's doing really well.
And what's the name of it again?
Magic Rabbit.
Magic Rabbit. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a heck of a story.
And it's interesting too, because a lot of people, especially classic whiskey drinkers, they say, oh, I would never taste something like that. I don't want peanut butter. I want this flavored stuff. But when they do, they say, oh my God, that's really pretty good. And when I drink it, I mix it half and half with Blanco tequila, and I love it.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow. Tom, I really appreciate you coming on with me today. What stands out about this conversation isn't just the business or the whiskey, it's the mindset behind it, the discipline from the Navy, the willingness to take risks, and the persistence to build something where there wasn't a blueprint. That's a rare combination for anyone listening. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe, share it with your friends, and check out Cleveland Whiskey and the story behind it. We'll see you in the next podcast soon. Tom, thank you very much. I really
love it, Joe.
appreciate
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who's been listening.
All right. Have a great evening, Tom.
Take care.